The factors are 3 and 1. The solutions are x equals 3 and x equals 1.
A letter arrived at the University of Chicago on a bone-cold morning in February 1902. It was written in the trembling hand of a janitor named Elias Crum, who apologized for times for his poor spelling before arriving at the point. He described a colored girl, a washerwoman's daughter, no more than 13 years old, who had been discovered alone in the university's physics laboratory at 1:30 in the morning, standing before a floor-to-ceiling chalkboard, her arm moving in long, sweeping arcs. The board had been covered for 3 weeks with a partially solved problem that the physics department's most senior faculty could not complete. A theoretical framework for calculating thermal stress distribution in pressurized steam chambers under variable atmospheric conditions, a problem with enormous industrial implications, one whose solution had eluded engineers building railroads and factories across the American Midwest. When Crum pushed open the laboratory door that February night, he found the board no longer partial. It was finished, every line filled in, every variable resolved. 17 steps of differential calculus and thermodynamic reasoning, worked out in precise, even script that curved slightly at the ends of each numeral, as though the numbers themselves had been drawn with affection. The girl stood with her back to him, chalk dust white against her dark fingers, her shoulders trembling. When Elias Crum cleared his throat, she spun around, and he saw her face. She had been crying. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She pressed herself against the board as though she could disappear into it. "I'm so sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't be here. The mathematics was broken. It was sitting there broken, and I could see where it needed to go, and it hurt to leave it that way, like a wound that needed closing." Crum, a practical man, a man whose job was to sweep chalk dust off floors, not puzzle over what put it there, did something remarkable. Before he wiped the board clean, as was his nightly procedure, he copied every line of the girl's work into his logbook. A precaution, evidence of whatever strange thing had just happened in this room. He mailed that logbook to Professor Edmund Callaway, chair of the University of Chicago's Department of Applied Physics. Callaway had been in academia for 32 years. He had received letters claiming miraculous discoveries before: perpetual motion machines, unified field theories from farm laborers. He burned most correspondence of this nature without finishing the first page. But something stopped him from burning this one. Perhaps it was the janitor's obvious bewilderment, the way Crum's letter kept doubling back on itself, as though the man couldn't quite believe his own report and was checking it against itself as he wrote. Perhaps it was the specific nature of what was described. Callaway knew that problem. His doctoral students had been fighting it for 6 weeks. The idea that a colored child, presumably uneducated, presumably illiterate, had solved what his best people couldn't was, on its face, absurd. And yet, Callaway checked Crum's transcription that same afternoon, then checked again after dinner, then brought it to 2 colleagues the following morning. The solution was correct. Not merely correct. It was elegant, the mathematical equivalent of a beautiful sentence, expressing in the fewest possible symbols exactly what needed to be said. It used an approach none of the faculty had considered, a way of visualizing heat as a directional force moving through material the way wind moves through grass, bending things predictably by rules that could be mapped. Whoever had done this didn't just know mathematics. They saw it. They understood the invisible geometry underneath equations the way a musician hears harmony underneath noise. Professor Edmund Callaway left for the south side of Chicago 4 days later, carrying a notebook, 3 freshly sharpened pencils, and skepticism so large it had begun to feel, for the first time in his life, fragile. Before I tell you what happened when Callaway found Amara Osei and her mother in their basement room on Dearborn Street, I need to ask you something. If you are the kind of person who believes that genius doesn't care what body it appears in, that brilliance doesn't ask permission before it arrives, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me what story you want us to uncover next. I'm building something here, a community that refuses to let the buried stay buried. Now let me tell you what the professor discovered and why it would take everything he thought he knew about the human mind and quietly, irreversibly break it. The south side of Chicago in 1902 was a city within a city, dense, breathing, invisible to the people who lived 6 blocks north. The Great Migration had barely begun, but already the neighborhood absorbed thousands, freed people, their children, their grandchildren, alongside waves of Eastern European immigrants, all of them crammed into boarding houses and basement apartments and rented rooms above taverns. The smell of the stockyards drifted in from the west on certain mornings, thick and metallic, clinging to clothes and curtains. Amara Osei lived with her mother, Abina, in the basement unit of a 4-story brick building on Dearborn Street. To call it a room was generous. It was a divided space, a curtain separating the sleeping area from what served as a kitchen and sitting room, with a single high window near the ceiling that admitted, on good days, a pale rectangle of winter light. The building's stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood. Calloway descended to the basement level, aware that his wool overcoat cost more than the family's monthly rent. He knocked. The woman who answered was perhaps 38, her face drawn in the specific way that comes from years of physical labor and chronic, low-grade worry. She wore a dark dress protected by an apron still damp from a morning's work. She was a laundress by trade, took in the washing of families who lived 6 blocks north, the kind of work that reddened hands and curved spines before their time. When she saw Calloway, something moved behind her eyes. Fear, controlled almost instantly, replaced with the careful blankness that is its own kind of armor. "Mrs. Osei, I'm Professor Edmund Calloway from the University of Chicago. I'm looking for your daughter, Amara." Abina's hand tightened on the door frame. "What has she done?" "Nothing wrong. Quite the opposite, I think. I need to speak with her." Abina's expression didn't change. She had the look of a woman who had learned that white men saying quite the opposite still usually meant trouble. But she stepped back and admitted him. The room was immaculate in the way that only poverty, fiercely maintained, can be. Not a surface wasted, not an object out of place. On the small table, a kerosene lamp, 2 mismatched chairs. In the corner, a pallet of blankets where the girls slept. A single shelf holding 4 objects, a chipped ceramic cup, a Bible with a broken spine, a folded piece of newspaper, and smooth gray stone that looked as though it had been carried a long way. A girl sat on the floor beneath the window, her knees drawn up, a piece of brown paper bag spread across them. She was writing on it. Numbers. She was 13 years old and small for her age, narrow through the shoulders, her neck long, her head slightly too large for her body in the way of children who are still growing into their own minds. Her skin was a deep, warm brown. Her hair was braided tightly in rows against her skull. She wore a dress of dark wool, too short at the hem, carefully mended at both elbows. When she looked up at Calloway, he felt something he had not experienced in many years of professional life. Discomfort. Not embarrassment, not pity, something more specific than either. Her eyes were large and very dark, and they moved across his face the way eyes move across a blackboard, reading, assessing, categorizing. She was not intimidated by him. She was measuring him. "Amara." Her mother's voice carried a warning underneath. "This is Professor Calloway, from a university where I clean." "I know who he is," Amara said quietly. "I've seen him in the building. He walks very fast, and he talks to himself when he's working through something difficult." She paused. "Is this about the chalkboard?" "Yes," Calloway said. "I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't have touched it." "Why did you?" The question seemed to confuse her, as though the answer was so obvious that the question itself was strange. "Because it was wrong," she said. In the third sequence, the assumption about heat gradient direction. The professors were treating the distribution as isotropic, but heat in pressurized material doesn't move that way. It follows the path of least resistance through the molecular structure. I've watched it. In Mama's wash boiler. In the factory pipes on Halsted Street. You can see it if you watch long enough. The mathematics has to match what's real, or it isn't mathematics. It's just symbols. Calloway stood very still. You watched heat move through industrial pipes, he said carefully, and derived a correction to a graduate-level thermodynamics problem. I didn't derive anything, Amara said. I just saw where it needed to go. The examination that followed lasted 2.5 hours. Calloway had not planned to conduct a proper assessment. He had come to satisfy a curiosity, to confirm what he already suspected, which was that some mistake had been made, some misunderstanding. He had brought his notebook out of professional habit. He did not put away again. He started simply arithmetic, then algebra, then geometry. Amara solved each problem before he finished writing it down, often looking up at him with an expression that was not impatience, but something close to it. As though the problems were the wrong shape, too simple, misfit for the space in her mind they were meant to fill. He moved into calculus, differential equations, complex boundary value problems that his second-year graduate students struggled with. Amara's pace never changed. She didn't write out her work in the conventional way. She drew pictures first, strange, precise diagrams that represented mathematical relationships visually, as though she had to see the shape of an equation before she could solve it. Then she worked backward from the diagram to the symbols, translating something three-dimensional and intuitive into the flat language of written mathematics. "Show me how you see this one," Calloway said, after she had solved a problem in fluid dynamics that he had spent 2 days working through as a doctoral student. Amara thought for a moment. Then she took the pencil and drew a shape, not a formula, not a graph, but something that looked almost like a landscape. Rolling curves, arrows indicating direction, small hash marks showing areas of density. "The fluid is like this," she said. "It wants to go here." She tapped one region, but these boundaries push it this way, so it can only go there. She traced a path. And that gives you your pressure differential. You don't need the full integration if you can see the shape. You can almost read it. Calloway stared at the drawing for a long moment. "Where did you learn to do this?" "I didn't learn it," Amara said. "It's just how I see things." He asked her about her education. She had attended a colored school on the South Side for 3 years before her mother could no longer afford to let her out of the house during work hours. Since then, she had taught herself to read more fully by borrowing newspapers, reading every book left in a university building on cleaning nights, matching written symbols to the sounds she knew. She had been doing mathematics in her head for as long as she could remember, not because she had been taught to, but because numbers were simply there, arranged in patterns she couldn't help following. "When you look at an equation," Calloway said, "what do you actually see?" Amara looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. "Architecture," she said. "Every equation is a building. It has a foundation and walls and a roof. If one piece is wrong, the whole structure is wrong, and I can feel it. Like when a floor isn't level, you don't see it, but you feel the wrongness when you walk across it. Mathematics is like that for me. Wrong mathematics feels wrong physically." She pressed a hand briefly against her sternum. "In here." The silence that followed was the kind that falls in rooms where something genuinely unexpected has just happened. Abina, who had been standing by the curtain that divided the room, spoke for the first time in an hour. Her voice was careful, each word chosen. "Professor, is my daughter sick?" Calloway looked at her. "No. The other women on this street, they say she's strange. That a child shouldn't think the way she thinks. I've been afraid she had some kind of affliction." "She has no affliction," Calloway said. And then, because he was a man who had spent his life in pursuit of exact truth, he added, "What she has is extraordinary. She is solving problems that trained mathematicians cannot solve. She is understanding concepts intuitively that require years of university education to approach formally. I have been in this field for 32 years, and I have never," he stopped, "started again. Mrs. Osei, your daughter may be the most mathematically gifted individual I have ever encountered." Abina was quiet for a long moment. Something moved across her face, pride and grief so closely intertwined they were almost indistinguishable. "Will it help her?" she asked. "Whatever you do with what you've found, will it help her?" Professor Calloway returned to the University of Chicago and did 2 things simultaneously. He wrote to 4 colleagues whose intellectual honesty he trusted absolutely, asking them to make the journey to Dearborn Street to verify what he had witnessed. And he went to the university's administrative board to propose what he called a special arrangement for a student of unusual circumstances. The response to his colleagues was unanimous. Within 3 weeks, 4 of the most respected scientists in the American Midwest had sat across from Amara Osei in her basement room and emerged shaken, white-faced, temporarily unable to speak. All 4 confirmed Calloway's assessment. One of them, a physicist named Dr. Harlan Voss, who had studied briefly under Lord Kelvin in London, wrote in a letter afterward, "I have witnessed something today that I cannot explain within any existing framework." The girl does not merely solve problems. She extends them. She moves into territory beyond the question asked, identifies implications that were not sought, and does so with the confidence of someone reading a text she has already memorized. And yet she has never been taught any of this. The question of how this is possible may occupy me for the rest of my professional life. The administrative board's response was more complicated. The University of Chicago had never admitted a colored student. Its charter was technically open to all, but in practice, its student body was entirely white and largely male. The board members who gathered to hear Calloway's proposal were not uniformly hostile. Some were genuinely moved by what he described, but they were unanimous about one thing. This could not be made public. The reasoning was not entirely cynical. Some board members argued sincerely that publicity would harm Amara, that she would become an object of curiosity, that newspapers would sensationalize her, that the attention could be psychologically damaging to a 13-year-old girl already navigating a difficult world. Others were more honest about their concerns, that publicly acknowledging a colored child's intellectual superiority to white graduate students would create controversy, alienate donors from the South and Midwest, and invite the kind of political scrutiny that universities found expensive. The compromise reached, Amara Osei would be given access to the university's library and laboratory resources 3 nights per week, in the hours after the building closed. She would work with a rotating group of faculty members willing to participate. Her existence would not be acknowledged in any official record. She would be, for all institutional purposes, a ghost. Calloway knew this was inadequate. He accepted it anyway because it was more than nothing. He brought the terms to Abina. Abina listened. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they did not move during Calloway's entire explanation, a stillness so complete it suggested enormous effort. "She's allowed to learn," Abina said when he finished. "But no one's allowed to know she exists." In essence, yes. And what happens if someone does find out? Calloway was quiet for a moment. "I don't know." Abina looked at her daughter, who was sitting on the floor, apparently absorbed in a problem she had worked out in the margin of a newspaper advertisement for horse feed. She was not listening to the adults, or if she was, she had decided the mathematics was more interesting than her own future being negotiated above her. "Amara," Abina said. The girl looked up. "What do you want, baby?" Amara's answer was immediate, uncalculated. "I want to understand the parts one can't see yet. The mathematics I carry in my head, it's like a map with whole regions missing. I can feel the edges of what I don't know. I want to fill them in." Abina closed her eyes briefly. Then she looked at Calloway with an expression that was not gratitude, but something harder, more complicated. "If anything goes wrong," she said quietly, "if they try to take her from me or use her for something that isn't her benefit, I will take my daughter, and we will vanish from this city, and you will never find us. I've done it before. I know how." She said it without theatrics. It was the plainest kind of threat, the kind made by someone who has nothing left to lose and is simply informing you of a fact. "Understood," Calloway said. The arrangement began in March 1902. 3 nights a week, Amara entered the university's science building through a service door on the south side, guided by Elias Crum, who had become an unlikely guardian. She would climb to the second-floor seminar room, where Calloway or one of his rotating colleagues would be waiting, and for 4 to 6 hours, she would learn. Or rather, she would be given formal language for things she already understood intuitively. This was the pattern. Calloway would teach her the established methodology for a mathematical or scientific concept, and Amara would listen politely, then gently explain that she already understood the concept itself, but had not known what to call it. It was as though someone had shown her a map of a territory she had already explored on foot. The map was useful. It gave names to rivers, heights to mountains, but the territory was already familiar. She absorbed formal calculus in 6 weeks, advanced thermodynamics in 8. She read Newton's Principia Mathematica and found, in the margins of her own copy, a battered second-hand text Calloway had purchased for her, a series of notes suggesting refinements to problems Newton had considered solved. When Calloway checked them, 2 of the refinements were valid innovations. One of them anticipated work that would not be published by the formal mathematical community for another 15 years. She was 13 years old. The physicists who worked with her that spring described the experience in letters to each other that range from awed to genuinely unsettled. One wrote, "She corrects me mid-sentence. Not rudely, she apologizes every time, but she cannot help it when she sees an error. It is physically uncomfortable for her to let a wrong statement stand unaddressed. I am teaching a student who makes me feel, repeatedly, that the student has the wrong teacher." Another, "She does not think the way the rest of us think. We move through mathematics sequentially, step by step, the way one walks down a road. She seems to see the road from above, all of it simultaneously, its curves and destinations, and the distance between any 2 points visible at once. She does not calculate. She perceives. I have no other word for it." But even as Amara grew and learned and filled in the missing regions of her internal map, the fragility of her situation was becoming apparent. Secrets of this size generate pressure, and pressure seeks release. By April, whispers had reached beyond the faculty who knew. A laboratory assistant mentioned something at a social dinner. A librarian noticed that certain advanced texts were being checked out and returned in the middle of the night. Small tremors, each one individually ignorable, but collectively suggesting that the ground beneath the arrangement was beginning to shift. And from Louisville, Kentucky, a man named Dr. Victor Aldrich had begun writing letters to the university demanding information. Dr. Victor Aldrich was 51 years old, a physician by training and a racial theorist by compulsion. He had spent 20 years building a body of work that used the language and apparatus of science, skull measurements, reaction time studies, grip strength comparisons, to argue that the intellectual capacity of Black Americans was, by biology, inferior to that of white Americans. His work was cited in courtrooms. It appeared in textbooks. It had been quoted in congressional debates about education funding and voting rights. When rumors of a colored girl in Chicago solving advanced physics problems reached him, Aldrich did not dismiss them. He filed them, carefully, alongside a single notation: threat, investigate and neutralize. His letter to the university board arrived in May. It was 7 pages long, formally courteous, and carried the implicit threat of a man accustomed to institutional power. He proposed that a panel of outside scientists be permitted to examine the girl, a controlled, rigorous, documented examination to determine the authenticity of the claims being made. He cited precedents. He named colleagues who would participate. He framed it as an act of scientific due diligence. The board, already nervous, saw in this an opportunity to resolve the pressure. An examination by legitimate outside authorities would either confirm or deny what Calloway had reported. If it confirmed it, they would have documentation. If it denied it, and many of the board members privately hoped it would, the matter could be closed. Calloway argued vehemently against the examination. He had read Aldrich's published work. He knew the man's methodology, knew that the instruments of Aldrich's science were calibrated not to find truth, but to confirm a predetermined conclusion. Permitting Aldrich to examine Amara was not scientific due diligence. It was handing a child to someone who had already decided what to do with her. The board overruled him. The examination was scheduled for June 7, 1902. When Calloway told Abina, the woman's stillness was absolute and terrible. "What kind of examination?" she asked. "Mathematical. Problems presented by the panel. She answers them under observation." "And this Dr. Aldrich, what does he want?" He wants to prove she isn't what she is. And if he can't prove that, Calloway looked at his hands. Then he'll find another way to explain her. Abina was quiet for a long moment. I want to be in the room. The board won't allow it. Then I'll wait in the hall. I want to be close. Calloway nodded. He would allow her that, at least, even if it was all he could allow her. That night, he told Amara about the examination. She listened without expression. Then she said, "Will they try to say I cheated somehow? That someone taught me the answers beforehand?" "Almost certainly. And when they can't prove that?" Calloway was quiet. Amara nodded slowly, as though he had said something. "Will it matter? Whatever I prove to them in that room, will it change anything?" "I hope so. That's not the same as yes." "No," Calloway admitted. "It isn't." Amara looked out the window at the narrow slice of street visible from their basement level, boots and trouser hems passing at eye level, the bottom half of a world that moved above her. "Professor," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If the mathematics is true, if I solve what they give me correctly, elegantly, without any possibility of fraud, is there any answer they could give that would actually help me? That would open a door instead of closing one?" Calloway opened his mouth. "Closed it." "I didn't think so," Amara said. Not bitterly, just simply the way one states an observable fact. The room they chose was on the university's third floor, a formal space normally used for faculty presentations, its walls lined with portraits of serious-faced men in dark coats. A long oak table at one end seated the panel. 5 men, Dr. Victor Aldrich, 2 of his colleagues from Louisville institutions, and 2 of the university's own faculty members, both of whom Calloway considered decent people, but neither of whom had the authority or the will to override Aldrich. Calloway sat to the side, an observer, technically present, practically powerless. At the room's center, a single desk, a single chair, a chalkboard, and chalk. Amara entered at 9 in the morning, escorted by the university's administrator, a small, efficient man who addressed her neither kindly nor unkindly, but simply pointed her to the chair as though seating furniture. She wore her best dress, the dark wool one, mended at the elbows, too short at the hem, as clean as it could be made. She walked to the chair and sat with a stillness that, Calloway noticed, was the same stillness her mother used. Armor worn on the inside. She was 13 years old. The 5 men at the long table looked at her the way men look at specimens. "You are Amara Osei," Aldrich said. His voice was cordial in the way of men who have already decided the outcome of a conversation. "Daughter of the cleaning woman." "My mother is a laundress," Amara said. "Her name is Abina Osei." A small correction, delivered without aggression, but without apology. Aldrich's jaw moved. "We are here to conduct a scientific assessment of the claims made regarding your intellectual capacities. You will solve problems presented to you. You will explain your methods. You will submit to additional measurements if the panel determines them necessary. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Let's begin." The first hour moved through mathematics that Amara solved before the problems were fully articulated, often beginning to write before the examiner finished speaking. One of Aldrich's colleagues, a younger man named Dr. Preston Holt, leaned forward at the third problem, watching her hand move across the chalkboard. "Stop," he said. "Don't write it. Tell me what you're doing." Amara stopped, turned. "I'm restructuring the boundary conditions so the differential resolves directly instead of requiring the third integration. Would you like me to show you why that works?" Holt blinked. "Yes." She turned back to the board and drew, not equations but a shape, a visual representation, the landscape of the problem made visible. She explained it in language so simple that even a layperson could have followed it, then translated the shape back into symbols, showing how the picture and the mathematics described the same thing. When she finished, Holt sat back. He exchanged a look with the faculty member beside him that Calloway read clearly, "This is real." Aldrich's expression did not change. He waited until the second hour before presenting the problems he had prepared specifically for this examination, problems designed not to test her abilities, but to fail them. He included a problem with a deliberate internal contradiction, a scenario with incompatible specifications that had no valid solution. He included problems that required knowledge of advanced theoretical physics, hoping she would hit the edge of her self-taught learning. She caught the contradictory problem within 90 seconds. "Sir, I think this problem has an error." Her voice was careful, respectful but clear. "These two conditions are incompatible. If the chamber pressure is X, then the temperature gradient can't simultaneously satisfy both boundary constraints. Would you like me to demonstrate why, or should I solve both versions separately and show you which is physically realistic?" The room went very quiet. "Solve it as written," Aldrich said. "I can't, sir. It has no valid solution. Solving it as written would require accepting a mathematical impossibility." "Perhaps," Aldrich said thinly, "you simply cannot solve it." Amara looked at him. Her expression was measured in a way that required enormous self-control from someone 13 years old. "Sir, the problem has no solution because you wrote it that way, either intentionally or in error. I can show you both contradicting conditions on the board if you'd like." Aldrich said nothing. "I'd like to see that," Holt said quietly. Amara turned to the board and demonstrated it in 8 lines. It was irrefutable. The silence afterward was the silence of a room in which a man's authority has been visibly eroded, and everyone knows it. They broke for lunch. During the recess, Calloway found a moment to speak with Amara privately in the hallway. She was standing very still, her hands at her sides. "Are you all right?" he asked. "He's going to keep changing what he's testing," she said. "The mathematics isn't what he's really looking for." "What do you mean?" "He wants me to make a mistake that isn't about mathematics. He wants me to be rude or frightened or to cry. He wants evidence that my emotions are uncontrolled." She paused. "Because if my intellect is real, then the only argument he has left is that I'm emotionally or psychologically deficient in some other way, that the intelligence and the instability go together." Calloway stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because that's the logic of his position. I've been thinking about it." She looked at the closed examination room door. "If I solve everything perfectly and behave with perfect composure, he has no argument. So he needs to make the examination unpleasant enough that I stop behaving with perfect composure. Then stay composed." "I intend to." She looked at him sideways. "You should know that Mama is sitting on the floor at the end of the hall. She brought knitting. She won't leave." Calloway felt something in his chest loosen very slightly. "Good." The afternoon session was harder. Aldrich introduced what he called psychological assessment, questions designed not to test mathematics, but to destabilize. He asked Amara about her living conditions, whether she had ever stolen books, whether her mother had ever been in legal trouble, whether she had ever been in spaces she wasn't permitted to be in. The implication was clear. Not a scientist examining an intellect, but a prosecutor building a case. Amara answered each question factually, briefly, and without elaboration. Then Aldrich leaned forward. "Miss Osei, do you understand that if the claims made about your abilities are verified, it creates a significant scientific problem? That there are established theories about the biological basis of intellectual capacity that your supposed abilities would contradict?" Amara looked at him with those large, measuring eyes. "Sir," she said, "are you asking whether I understand that my existence is inconvenient for you?" The room went absolutely still. "I'm asking whether you understand the significance." "I understand the significance," Amara said quietly. "I've understood it since Professor Calloway first came to our room. If I can do what I can do, then what you've written is wrong. And I've read some of what you've written, sir. People like my mother are described in it as inherently limited, as suited for certain kinds of work and not for others. Your entire scientific career is built on that conclusion." She paused. "I'm not angry about it. I'm just saying the mathematics doesn't care about your career. If the proof is correct, it's correct. That's the thing about mathematics. It's one of the only places in the world where the truth doesn't negotiate." Aldrich's face had gone the color of old brick. "You are impertinent," he said. "I've been told," Amara said. "Usually by people who asked me a question and then didn't want the answer." In the corner, Professor Calloway pressed his hand briefly over his mouth to conceal an expression that would have been professionally inadvisable. What happened next was the part of the examination that had made Calloway's stomach drop when he first read the proposed agenda. Cranial measurement. In 1902, the practice of measuring skull dimensions as a proxy for intellectual capacity was considered legitimate science. Aldrich was its foremost practitioner. He had published extensively on the relationship between cranial volume, facial angles, and cognitive function. His measurements of hundreds of skulls, living and dead, formed the empirical foundation of his racial theories. He wanted to measure Amara's head. Calloway had tried to have this portion removed from the agenda. The board had declined, reasoning that it was standard scientific protocol. Aldrich produced his instruments from a leather case with the care of a man handling sacred objects, calipers, measuring tapes, a small device for assessing facial angle. He approached Amara with these tools and the manner of someone who's already decided what they will find. "Stand up," he said. "This won't hurt." Amara stood. Her chin came up slightly. She looked at a fixed point on the opposite wall and went very still in the way she had inherited from her mother, the stillness of someone who has learned that endurance is its own kind of power. For 20 minutes, Aldrich measured. Skull length, skull width, facial angle, ear placement. He called out numbers, and his assistant recorded them. He repositioned the calipers several times, studying his readings with increasing frustration. Then he stepped back, examined his data. The measurements were unremarkable. Normal range for a 13-year-old girl. Nothing that conformed to the hierarchical patterns his theories predicted. He studied the numbers for a long time. "Inconclusive," he said finally. "The measurements require broader comparative context." "What does that mean?" Holt asked. "It means that a single case cannot be assessed without a control population." Aldrich was already repacking his instruments. "We would need extended study, multiple examinations over time, a controlled environment." "You mean you want to keep her somewhere?" Calloway said. He had been silent for 2 hours. He was silent no longer. "You want a controlled environment, which means removing her from her home, isolating her, treating her as a research subject rather than a human being. I'm proposing proper scientific methodology. You're proposing captivity. Don't be dramatic. She is 13 years old. She is sitting in that chair because you found her inconvenient. She has answered every question you've posed, caught your errors, surpassed every standard you've applied, and you are now proposing that the correct response is to lock her away until you find an explanation that fits your existing conclusions. Calloway's voice was very controlled and very cold. That is not science. That is the suppression of evidence that threatens a theory. The room held a charged silence. Then Amara spoke. Her voice was quiet and even. "Professor Calloway is right," she said. "But I'd like to say something if I may." All 5 men at the long table looked at her. "Dr. Aldrich," she said, "you've spent this whole day testing me. You've checked my mathematics and found it correct. You've tried to destabilize me and found that I can hold my composure. You've measured my head and found nothing that serves your theory. At what point does evidence change what you believe? That is not the proper." "It's a serious question," she said, "because I've been thinking about the scientific method, the part where you revise your theory based on evidence. I'm evidence. I'm sitting right in front of you. The mathematics I solved today is either correct or it isn't. If it's correct, your theory about who is capable of this mathematics needs revision." She paused. "Unless the problem is that you don't actually believe in the scientific method. Unless the theory was never meant to follow the evidence. Unless the measurements and the skull calipers and the examination rooms are just costumes that the conclusion wears to look like science." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. Deeper, more final. Aldrich stood. He gathered his papers. His hands were not quite steady. "We will prepare our report," he said, to no one in particular. He walked out. 3 of the other 4 men followed him. Only Holt remained, sitting at the long table, looking at Amara with an expression she had not seen from a white man in this room today. Something like respect. "Miss Osei," he said, "for what it's worth, I will not sign any report that misrepresents what I witnessed here today." "Thank you, sir," she said. "But I don't think that will be enough." She was right. It took Aldrich 3 weeks to arrange it. He had connections Calloway hadn't fully mapped, a network of institutional relationships, legal contacts, men who owed him favors and shared his investment in the social architecture he'd spent his career defending. On June 30th, 1902, Amara Osei was taken. The legal instrument was a custody order declaring her a ward of the state on grounds of parental incapacity, a vague designation attached to findings that Abina's home environment was unsuitable for a child of special medical and cognitive needs, those needs being carefully undefined. The order had been signed by a judge whom Aldrich had known since law school. It happened at 7 in the morning, before Calloway could be reached. 3 men in dark coats and a police constable arrived at the Dearborn Street address. When Abina came to the door, they showed her the papers and walked past her. Amara was found on her sleeping pallet, still dressed, already awake. She had heard the knock. When they reached for her, she did not fight. She looked back at her mother over her shoulder as they guided her toward the door, not the look of a frightened child, but the look of someone calculating an impossible problem, weighing variables, looking for a path that isn't there. Abina screamed. She screamed until neighbors came out of their rooms. She screamed her daughter's name. By the time Calloway arrived at 9 o'clock, the street was quiet. Abina was sitting on the front step of their building, not screaming anymore, her face the face of someone who has gone somewhere inside themselves and not entirely come back. "Where did they take her?" Calloway asked. "A place called the Meridian Institute," Abina said. Her voice was flat. "In the countryside west of the city." The Meridian Institute occupied 40 acres of former farmland outside Naperville, Illinois, surrounded by stone walls and iron gates and what its brochures described as therapeutic grounds. Its official designation was a facility for the study and treatment of unusual cognitive conditions. Its actual function in 1902 was to serve as a private research environment for the kind of scientific work that required subjects to be unable to leave. Professor Edmund Calloway spent the first 10 days after Amara's removal attempting every official remedy available to him. He appealed to the university board, who expressed sympathy and no action. He hired a lawyer who filed a motion that was denied within a week. He wrote to newspaper editors, 2 of whom declined to print stories that challenged judicial authority, and one of whom sent a reporter who wrote a 4-paragraph piece that ran on page 7 and was forgotten by the following morning. The system had been built specifically to make this kind of intervention difficult. A breakthrough came from inside the facility. 14 days after Amara's abduction, a letter arrived at Calloway's university office. It was written on plain paper in a steady, educated hand. No return address. The signature read only, "A friend." The letter described what was happening to Amara in the Meridian Institute with the specificity of a witness. She was in a room on the 2nd floor, East Wing. She was allowed no books, no paper, no writing instruments outside of supervised testing sessions. She was examined daily, mathematical assessments under time conditions, psychological tests designed to map the emotional correlates of her intellectual performance, physical measurements repeated at intervals. She was not mistreated in ways that left visible marks. But she was in isolation, forbidden to speak to staff except to answer direct questions, her meals delivered by attendants who had been instructed not to engage in conversation. She recites mathematics to herself in the dark, the letter said. "I hear her through the wall at night. She recites proofs and theorems and calculations very quietly, as though she's afraid she'll forget them if she stops. I've been at this facility for 7 years, and I have never felt ashamed of my work here until now. What I see done to this child is not medicine and is not science. It is the study of a person who has been reduced to a specimen. Please, Professor, if you can do anything, do it quickly. She is strong, but she grows quieter each week." Calloway read the letter 4 times. Then he went to find Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was not easy to find. He was a former Pinkerton man who had left the agency over what he described only as a disagreement about which side of a line I was willing to stand on. He worked independently now, taking cases he found interesting, which meant cases that involved people who were being treated unjustly by systems designed to treat them that way. He found this case very interesting. Calloway gave him everything: the location, the layout as described in the letter, the timing of staff rotations, the name of the correspondent inside the facility. Webb listened with the focused attention of someone assembling a mechanism, asking precise questions and taking careful notes. "You understand what you're asking," Webb said when Calloway finished. "This is extraction from a state-sanctioned facility. If we're caught, you lose your position, your reputation, and probably your freedom. And the girl ends up in worse conditions. I understand. And you're willing to do it anyway. She's 13 years old and she's being caged because she's too intelligent for powerful men to tolerate." "Yes, I'm willing." Webb nodded. "Then I need 2 weeks to map the facility, and I need a contact on the inside." The inside contact was the letter's author, a nurse named Constance Dre, who agreed, after 2 tense conversations conducted through a university intermediary, to help. Her price was enough money to leave Illinois and start over, and Calloway's word that her name would never be spoken. He gave her both. Constance provided what they needed: Amara's exact room number, the location of the key, and a time when the facility's internal attention would be elsewhere. She would trigger the fire alarm at 8:15 on July 22nd, giving them a window of approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Calloway had never, in 32 years of academic life, done anything that wasn't protected by institutional authority. He had published controversial papers from behind the shield of the university's reputation. He had advocated for unpopular positions from the safety of tenure. Now, standing in the tree outside the Meridian Institute's east wall, as the sun went down on July 22, 1902, he understood for the first time what it was to act without a net. Abina was waiting with a wagon half a mile down the road. "Ready?" Webb said. "No," Calloway said. "Let's go." At 8:15, the alarm bells began. They moved. The service entrance lock yielded to Webb in 40 seconds. Inside, the facility was exactly the controlled chaos Constance had predicted. Staff converging toward the alarm, guards following procedure, the building's attention pointed in the wrong direction. Calloway and Webb moved against the current, ascending the east wing stairs, counting doors. Room 11. The key from the nurse's station. First key wrong. Second key wrong. Third key. The door opened. Amara Osei sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. She was thinner. Her hair had grown out unevenly, escaping its braids, and her institutional gown was too large for her frame. When the door opened, she pressed herself against the wall with a convulsive movement, and then recognition arrived, and something that had been pulled very tight in her face went slack. "Professor Calloway, come with me right now." He crossed the room, took her hand. "Can you run?" Yes. They ran. The corridor, the stairs, the ground floor, the service entrance, cold air, and the smell of summer grass, and the distant sound of more voices, footsteps, someone shouting. Webb had a guard occupied at the far end of the hallway, physically occupied, in a way that produced sounds Calloway didn't look back at. The wall. 8 feet of stone. Webb arrived beside them, breathing hard, interlaced his fingers. Up. Now. Amara put her foot in the cradle of his hands, and he lifted her. She grabbed the top of the wall, pulled herself over with an arm strength born of years, helping her mother with heavy washing, dropped on the far side. Calloway followed, less gracefully, landing wrong on his left ankle, pain shooting to his knee, irrelevant. They ran for the tree lean. Behind them, the facility was waking up to what had actually happened. Half a mile down the road, lantern light. A wagon. Abina standing beside it, not running toward them because running would have looked wrong to anyone passing, but standing with her whole body, reaching forward. When Amara cleared the tree line, Abina's composure broke entirely. She moved. Amara moved. They collided in the middle of the dark road, and the sounds that Abina made were the sounds of someone who's held something together by will alone for 22 days and has now, finally, been given permission to let it go. Calloway stood a few feet away, breathing, his ankle throbbing, watching a mother hold her daughter in the middle of a dark road in Illinois and thinking that he had spent 32 years studying the forces that hold physical structures together and had never understood, until this moment, what force actually looked like. "Get in the wagon," he said gently. "We need to move." They drove through the night. Calloway had arranged a safe house, a Quaker farm in northern Wisconsin whose owner asked nothing and offered everything: rooms, food, time. They arrived at dawn. Abina got her daughter inside, got her fed, got her into a bed. Calloway sat in a kitchen chair and didn't move for an hour. When Amara came back out, she sat across from him at the kitchen table. She was still thin, still quiet, but something in her face had settled. The pulled-tight quality was gone. "Professor," she said, "I need to tell you what Aldrich was planning. You don't have to do that now." "I do." She looked at her hands, flat on the table. "He came to my room twice a week. He talked about his theories in front of me, as if I weren't there, as if I was a chalkboard." She paused. "Last week, he brought another doctor, a brain surgeon from Indianapolis. They discussed what they called the definitive study, an examination that would resolve, once and for all, the physiological basis of my abilities." Calloway waited. "They were going to perform a surgical procedure," Amara said. "They called it exploratory mapping. Open my skull, identify and document the brain regions associated with my mathematical capacity, remove samples for laboratory examination." Calloway's mouth was very dry. "They mentioned," Amara said, still in that same quiet, factual voice, "that I would not survive the procedure. They called that an acceptable outcome, a contribution to scientific knowledge." She looked up at him. "The surgeon said I should be grateful that my death would have meaning." In 32 years of academic life, Edmund Calloway had never hated anyone. He understood, sitting in a Wisconsin farmhouse kitchen in the dawn of July 1902, that he had been wrong about himself. "He will never touch you again," he said. His voice was very steady. "I promise." Amara looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, in the way of someone accepting a fact. "What happens now?" she asked. "We get you somewhere they can't follow. Canada, most likely. Toronto. And we give you a new name and enough time and resources to continue your education. And you. I come with you." He said it simply, without heroics. "I can't send you into hiding and stay here pretending none of this happened. I'm complicit in the conditions that made it possible. I need to see it through." Amara was quiet for a moment. "You'll lose everything." "I'll lose my position and my institutional identity," he said. "That's not the same as everything." She looked at him with those measuring eyes. Then, for the first time in 22 days, she almost smiled. "All right," she said. "But Professor, I want to learn as much as possible before we leave. Whatever time we have here. I want to fill in as many gaps as I can while I still have access to you properly. We have a week, possibly 10 days. What do you want to start with?" "Everything," she said. "I want to start with everything." They crossed into Canada on August 3, 1902. The border guards reviewed their documents, papers identifying them as the Cole family, a widowed professor relocating to Toronto with his housekeeping staff, and waved them through. 3 more Americans among thousands. Unremarkable. Professor Edmund Calloway became Edward Cole. Abina became Anna. Amara became Mabel. Mabel Cole. A name that had nothing of Amara Osei in it, and this was precisely the point. Toronto in 1902 was a city in the act of becoming, a place where the visible and the invisible worlds had been negotiating the terms of coexistence for decades. The community they found in the city's ward neighborhood understood displacement without needing it explained. They were taken in by a woman named Ruth Harrisburg, whose parents had come north via routes that did not appear on official maps, who ran a boarding house on Adelaide Street where no one asked too many questions. The first months were adjustment and survival. Calloway tutored wealthy Toronto families' children in mathematics. Abina found work as a seamstress, the upgrade from laundress she had earned by crossing a border. Amara, Mabel, slowly recovered. The recovery was not linear. She had nightmares. She could not tolerate locked rooms. She startled at footsteps in hallways. And she could not do mathematics. This was the symptom that frightened Calloway most. When he presented her with problems she would have solved in minutes before, she looked at the paper and something happened to her face. A tightening, a flinching. The mathematics had been contaminated by its association with Aldrich's examinations. Every equation was a reminder of the room she'd been kept in. Every calculation brought back the sound of the surgical discussion she'd been made to overhear. "It's gone," she told Calloway one evening, 6 weeks after their arrival. "The way I could see it, the architecture. It's like someone covered the windows." "It isn't gone," he said. "It's buried. Trauma does that. It covers things that hurt to look at." "But what if it doesn't come back?" "Then you are still worthwhile," he said with more conviction than she could at that moment feel. "And you are still worth protecting. But I believe it will come back." It came back in October. Amara was walking through the St. Lawrence market with her mother when she stopped in front of a fishmonger's stall, staring at the wooden tanks where live fish were displayed. The water moved in a specific pattern, pushed by a small mechanical paddle, creating intersecting currents, oscillating in a rhythm she recognized. She stood completely still for nearly 2 minutes. Then she said quietly, "The fluid dynamics. I can see it again." Abina looked at her daughter's face and recognized the expression. The slightly unfocused gaze, the lips moving without sound, the hand lifting to trace invisible lines in the air. "Baby," she said, "it's coming back, Mama." Amara turned to her, and her face was doing something complex and wet. "It's coming back." By the spring of 1903, Amara's abilities had returned, not to their former level, but beyond it. Calloway did not have a complete explanation for this. His best theory was that the months of apparent dormancy had allowed her mind to reorganize itself, making new connections without the interference of conscious effort. The trauma had been a crucible of a different kind. What emerged from it was subtly, but measurably more sophisticated than what had gone in. She was 14 years old and working in territory that Calloway could no longer fully follow. He found her tutors, professors at the University of Toronto, willing to work with a gifted student in private without asking too many questions. He found a physicist named Dr. Leonard Baines, who met Amara once and then met with Calloway privately afterward to say, in the blunt manner of a man who did not waste words, "She needs teachers I'm not qualified to find. I'll help with what I can, and I'll write to everyone I know." 3 other academics joined the informal arrangement over the following months. Together, they provided Amara with the equivalent of a graduate education, working through evenings and weekends in Calloway's rented study on Adelaide Street. She was a student who made her teachers feel simultaneously adequate and obsolete. And then came the problem that would define the rest of her life. She produced a paper. She was 15, and she had spent 4 months working through a problem in non-Euclidean geometry that the formal mathematical community had been circling for a decade without resolution. Her solution was not a brute force proof. It was a conceptual reframing that made the problem suddenly obvious, the way a visual illusion resolves when you tilt your head. She had drawn it first as a diagram, her invariable approach, and then translated the diagram into the formal language Baines had taught her, then shown it to Calloway. He checked it for 3 days. It was correct. It was more than correct, important. The kind of result that would appear in the field's major journals. The kind of result that would be cited for decades. And it could not be published under the name Amara Osei. And Amara Osei did not exist in the records of Canadian or American academia. A colored girl from Chicago had vanished from a state facility and become a ghost. Publishing under her name meant creating a trail. Creating a trail meant being found. Calloway brought the possibility to her as carefully as he could. He explained what he was proposing. He did not minimize the unfairness. "You write the work," Amara said. "I do the mathematics. You get the credit." "Yes." "And the field advances, using my mathematics, without knowing it came from me." "Yes." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Calloway began to think she was simply not going to answer. "Will you document it?" she said finally. "The real authorship. Everything. in a form that someone could find someday. I'll document everything. I swear it. And someday, when the world is different enough, the truth comes out. I hope so. I believe so. She looked at the window. Outside, Adelaide Street was ordinary and loud, vendors and horses, and a cold Toronto autumn. I want to say yes, she said, because I want to do the mathematics. I want to solve the problems. I want the work to reach people who might use it, build on it, make something real from it. She turned back to him. But I want you to understand what you're asking. You're asking me to disappear twice. First from the world that tried to destroy me, and now from the work I do to survive. I know. Promise me again, she said. Not just documentation. Promise me that you won't let it stay buried forever. That if I do this, if I spend years doing this, you will make sure someone eventually knows it was me. I promise, Calloway said, on everything I have left. She looked at him for a long moment with those measuring, ancient eyes. All right, she said. Let's start with the geometry paper. From 1903 to 1921, Professor Edward Cole published 22 papers in journals of mathematics, physics, and engineering. His work was recognized as belonging to a distinctive school of thought, intuitive, visual, occasionally unorthodox in its approach, but consistently rigorous, and more often than not, groundbreaking. His colleagues in Toronto respected him as an unconventional and productive thinker. They noted that his work seemed to undergo a qualitative shift around 1903, becoming somehow richer, more creative. Calloway attributed this, when asked, to the influence of teaching. None of them knew about the woman in the back study. Amara Osei Mabel Cole, officially, a name that cost her something every time she signed it, worked for 18 years in that study. She had a desk, a window overlooking a courtyard, an endless supply of the long paper pads she preferred, and access to every mathematical text Calloway could obtain. Her working method never changed. The diagram first. The landscape of the problem, drawn in pencil, showing its shape and structure, its pressure points, and its paths of resolution. Then the translation into symbols, the formal scaffolding built around the intuitive core. Then the revision, the polishing, the construction of the proof in language the formal community could follow. Then she handed it to Calloway, who wrote it up and mailed it under his name. She was a ghost in a back room, producing work that outlived every assumption about who was capable of producing it. Her 1906 paper on novel approaches to material stress distribution under dynamic loading became foundational to structural engineering, though history would file it under Calloway's name. Her 1911 work on turbulent flow prediction contained insights that would not be fully understood until chaos theory was formally developed 50 years later. Her 1918 analysis of wave propagation patterns in non-uniform media introduced a mathematical framework that physicists and acousticians would use for decades, always citing Cole, never knowing who Cole was. Abina watched her daughter work through those years with the complex eyes of a woman who understood exactly what the work cost and exactly what it was worth. In 1917, Abina sat down beside Amara one evening and said, "Baby, you're going to be 30 years old. I know, Mama. You've never had a friend your own age. Never had anyone you could be yourself with. I have you. That's not enough. I'm your mother. I don't count." Abina took her daughter's hand. "I'm not telling you to stop the work. I'm telling you that the work can't be all of you. There has to be something they didn't take." Amara was quiet for a long time. "There is," she said finally. "The mathematics itself. Not what it gets published as, not whose name it carries, the actual thinking. The moment when a problem resolves. The shape of a proof coming clear." She squeezed her mother's hand. "They can take the credit. They can erase my name. But they cannot take the moment when I see it. That's mine. That's always been mine." Abina held her daughter's hand and said nothing. But the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who knows that survival is not the same as victory and is trying to find a way to be grateful for survival anyway. In 1914, Dr. Victor Aldrich published a book. It was titled The Biological Basis of Intellectual Hierarchy, a Scientific Assessment of Racial Cognitive Capacity. 500 pages, decades of data, the summation of his life's work. In Chapter 9, there was a case study. He did not use Amara's name. He referred to her as Subject F, a colored female, age 13 at initial assessment, who had displayed apparently unusual mathematical performance. He described the examination at the University of Chicago. He described the subsequent institutional study. And then he described the conclusions of that study, which bore no relationship to what had actually happened. According to Aldrich's account, extended examination under controlled conditions had revealed that Subject F's apparent abilities were not genuine mathematical intelligence, but a form of idiot savant syndrome, rote computational skill, highly specific and completely divorced from general reasoning capacity. Further study had revealed psychological instability, emotional dysregulation, and an inability to function in structured educational environments. The subject had eventually been transferred to a long-term residential facility for her own welfare, where she was receiving appropriate care. He concluded, the case of Subject F is instructive not because it demonstrates Negro intellectual capacity, but because it demonstrates the danger of premature conclusions drawn from anomalous presentations. Apparent exceptions to established cognitive patterns, when subjected to rigorous examination, consistently prove to be explainable within existing theoretical frameworks. The temptation to assign political significance to statistical outliers must be firmly resisted by the scientific community. Amara read this chapter in a library copy of the book, sitting at a reading table in the University of Toronto's main branch in the autumn of 1914. She read it twice. Then she closed the book and sat for a long time with her hands flat on the cover. When she came home, she sat across from Calloway at the kitchen table. He made me into a warning, she said. Not just erased, inverted. He took what I am and turned it into evidence for what he wanted to prove. I know, and because I disappeared because I can't speak publicly, his version is the record. Future scientists will read that chapter and know about the Negro girl who seemed brilliant but wasn't. They'll know the danger of being fooled by anomalies like me. Calloway had no answer that was adequate. He sat across from her in the inadequacy. Can we refute it? She asked. Not without exposing you. Then we can't refute it. We continue doing the work, Calloway said. We continue advancing the field. The mathematics speaks. The mathematics speaks under your name, Amara said. Her voice was flat. Not angry, something past anger. Exhausted. And his book speaks under his. And history writes down whatever is loudest. She looked at the window. I used to think that truth was the most durable thing. That it didn't need protection, that it would last past the people who tried to bury it. She paused. I still believe that. I understand now how long the burial can last. Edmund Calloway died in 1923. He died in the house on Adelaide Street in his own bed, with Amara Osei sitting in the chair beside him. Amara, who had outlasted everything the world had thrown at her and stood now as steady as she had always stood, a little more gray, a little more careful with her joints in cold weather, but essentially unchanged. Amara was in the room. She held his hand. He had spent the previous year, knowing he was dying, putting together the record he had promised. A metal strongbox containing his complete account of Amara's discovery, the examination, the abduction, the rescue, the 18 years of collaboration. The original manuscripts in Amara's hand for every paper published under his name. A detailed attribution document, signed, witnessed, sealed with wax. His will instructed that the box be opened in 1953, 30 years hence, when he judged the world might be ready, though he acknowledged he was guessing. The box was placed in a safety deposit vault at a bank on King Street. 3 years later, the bank merged with another institution. The records were reorganized. The box was transferred to a storage facility in the subsequent confusion of inherited documentation. The original instructions for its opening were separated from the box during the transfer. It sat in a storage facility on the outskirts of Toronto for the next 47 years. After Calloway's death, Amara stopped working for other people's credit. She kept working. She worked in the small study on Adelaide Street until the building was sold in 1931, then in a rented room in the same neighborhood, then in a second room when her eyes required more light. She worked with mathematics that no longer had anywhere to go except into notebooks accumulated in stacks, filling the space around her small bed, organized by year and by subject in a system that existed entirely in her own head. Abina died in 1935 at 71. She went quietly in her sleep, which seemed to Amara like a mercy extended to a woman who had been anything but quiet in life. After her mother's death, Amara worked more. Not to fill the silence was not something that could be filled, but because the mathematics was the one room in the world that had always been hers. The room that Aldrich could not enter, that the legal system could not rule on, that the border guards could not confiscate. She worked in it for the rest of her life. By the time she died in April 1964, at the age of 79, she had filled 43 notebooks with advanced mathematics, work that anticipated information theory, quantum computing, chaos dynamics, topological data analysis. Work that was ahead of the published field by 15 years in some places, 20 in others. The notebooks sat in a trunk at the foot of her bed in a small apartment in the Ward neighborhood of Toronto, surrounded by the residue of a life lived carefully and at great cost. No one knew they existed. Her death certificate identified her as Mabel Cole, age 79, occupation seamstress, no surviving family, no notable achievements. In 2007, a doctoral candidate named Dr. Josephine Kruma was researching the history of Black intellectual life in early 20th century Toronto for her dissertation at the University of Toronto. She was looking for people who had left traces, letters, records, diaries, and had mostly not found them because the business of surviving does not leave much time for documentation. Then she found a death certificate for a woman named Mabel Cole, age 79. Date of birth, April 1884. The arithmetic made her stop. 13 in 1897. The right age to match fragmentary references she had encountered in the archives, a note in the margin of a 1902 Chicago newspaper referencing a colored girl of unusual capacity at the university. A letter in the private papers of a physicist named Holt describing an examination he had witnessed and been troubled by. A passage in Aldrich's book. Josephine Kruma spent 3 years following the thread. She found Constance Dre's descendants, who'd kept a letter their grandmother had written about the night she'd helped someone escape. She found the personnel records of the Meridian Institute, where an admission log listed a colored female minor, age 13, cognitive assessment study admitted June 1902, and noted as absconded 3 weeks later. She found the bank records that led her, eventually, to the storage facility and the metal strongbox. Edmund Calloway's account was intact. Every page, every document, the original manuscripts in Amara Osei's handwriting. She found the notebooks in 2011 through the auction records of Mabel Cole's estate, sold for $40 to a used goods dealer who had, by some unlikely grace, not thrown them away. When she showed the notebooks to a colleague in the mathematics department, he sat with them for an afternoon and then came back to say, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Joe, this woman was working on problems in 1947 that Shannon published in 1948. And some of these are still open questions. She was ahead of us." Josephine Kruma's book, Mabel Cole's Real Name, was published in 2013. It documented everything. It reproduced Amara's mathematics. It argued, with evidence that could not be dismissed, that one of the most important mathematical minds of the 20th century had spent her life in deliberate invisibility, her work stolen, her name erased, her story rewritten by the man who most feared what she represented. The book won awards. Symposiums were held. A scholarship was named for Amara Osei at the University of Chicago, in the department from which she had been excluded. There was also backlash. There always is. Some historians questioned the attributions. Some mathematicians argued the work, while impressive, had been overstated. Some commentators suggested the entire story was too convenient, too perfectly constructed to serve a contemporary political narrative. Amara Osei would not have been surprised by any of this. She had understood at 13 sitting in a boarding house basement with chalk dust on her hands, that truth and acknowledgement are not the same thing. That a proof can be correct and still be disputed by everyone with a reason to dispute it. But she had also understood. She had said it herself, in an examination room full of men who wanted to erase her, that mathematics doesn't negotiate with convenience. The proof stands, or it doesn't. Amara Osei existed. She was brilliant. She was stolen from, silenced, erased, and persisted anyway. She worked in notebooks for 40 years in a small apartment in Toronto, advancing human knowledge for the pleasure of the thought itself, because the mathematics was the one room in the world they couldn't lock her out of. She died as Mabel Cole. She lived as herself. What do we do with a story like this? How do we honor a life that produced so much and received so little, not just in her lifetime, but in the centuries since? Maybe we start with the question she never stopped asking: is the proof correct? Because if the proof is correct, then the conversation isn't over. It's barely begun. How many others are there? How many notebooks are in how many trunks, in how many storage facilities, in how many estates sold for $40 to used goods dealers who happen not to throw them away? How many Amara Oseis did we lose entirely? No strongbox, no correspondent who kept a letter, no thread for a doctoral candidate to follow. The horror of systematic erasure is not just that it destroys people. It destroys the evidence that they existed. But here is what I keep coming back to, thinking about Amara in that small room on Adelaide Street, working in her notebooks in the dark. She kept going, not because anyone would see it, not because history would credit her, but because the mathematics was real and the mathematics was hers, and no one, not Aldrich, not the courts, not the institutional machinery of a world that had decided she didn't matter, had been able to take that from her. Truth is more durable than the people who try to bury it. Amara Osei knew that. We're only just learning it. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that the buried deserve to be found, subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me which buried story you want us to uncover next. We're building something here. A record. A refusal to forget. Until next time.